whistle stop tour. And I'll be happy to answer any questions that you've got at the end. And I really look forward to being able to hear any questions that you do have. So, moving on, first of all, a little bit about me. You've already got the sort of background there, but there's my contact information. Please do feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. We'll be covering a lot of stuff. If you want to consider and reflect on all the things we discuss, and then contact me there on LinkedIn, or via email, please do feel free. I also have a podcast that you might find interesting to see, and that will mean that you'll be able to follow that as well. But in terms of what we want to talk about today, I wanted to start off looking at AI guidelines. This is the main thing that we've been helping our clients work on, is to implement, first of all, before doing anything else, some AI guidelines. Why is it important to do that? It's important because you need to ensure that you've got a basic framework within an organization. It can take a couple of years to get the types of full-on ISO accreditations that we're going to be talking about in this presentation. And sometimes the speed of the adoption of technology is such you need to get something in place to protect you, to protect your staff, and to make sure that you are buying, procuring the right products and systems for you without making any problems for yourself further down the line. Any AI guidelines should include, for example, the questions that you're going to ask of any AI or tech suppliers. For example, where are the servers located for your system? Where will personal data be stored? If you are looking to use these systems in countries like the UK or the European Union, they get very irate over wanting to ensure that they know where any data is being stored and how securely it is being stored. It is also important to ensure, for example, that you don't find yourself signing up to a long-term deal. You don't want to find yourself locked into, say, a 4-year deal for the provision of AI when you might want to break that contract after 6 months. So make sure you have a break clause. You will need to make sure that any system you use demonstrates compliance from a legal and regulatory perspective. Now, in the UK, they've gone for sector by sector regulation. That means that you end up with the accountants, for example, wanting to have certain standards in place. The banking and financial sector, through the UK Financial Conduct Authority, they have had guidance issued in terms of what AI should be used. The lawyers, through the Solicitors Regulatory Authority and the Bar Council, they've had standards and guidance issued. So it's going for a sector by sector approach. And if you aren't complying with what you need to for that sector, you could be in legal and regulatory breach. And that's where problems then come in. Before we come into areas like authorized and non-authorized AI use, what I mean by that is that, for example, if you are in a highly regulated entity carrying out something like banking, insurance, financial services, medicine, law, or accounting, have you actually said to your staff what systems are appropriate for them to use when it comes to using AI? You might have said, well, we haven't procured any AI yet, so our organization doesn't use AI. But your staff might be using AI. They might be using the free version of ChatGPT. They might be going on to X and using Grok. They could be going on to use various other systems that are out there, Perplexity, etc. They could be using AI, and because you haven't given them guidelines on what's acceptable to use and what isn't, they could be using AI in a way that isn't safe, secure, and compliant. For example, the Bar Council, the regulatory body for lawyers in the UK, for barristers, they have turned around and said, be very careful about what AI you use because of what it's been trained on, because AI has a propensity to hallucinate, and lawyers have been presenting cases in court using fabricated information, fabricated case references, fabricated cases that do not exist. And they haven't stopped to check, they haven't verified before finding themselves talking utter rubbish in court. This is an extreme example, but it illustrates the danger of relying on the wrong AI systems. And if you're doing that in a highly regulated sector, that will cause problems. So AI guidelines need to be in place to make sure that those sorts of things don't happen. AI has been used in so many different things now in terms of creative tasks to help with marketing collateral, to help with research, for example, screening of CVs, spelling, grammar, punctuation checks are very, very common, as well as recording meetings. like Zoom meetings, like we're all on now. I have come across systems that lawyers and accountants and bankers are using to record calls that do not comply from a legal and regulatory perspective, i.e., their recordings are being taken off to the United States. There is no adequate data sharing mechanism in place between that company and the data subjects in Europe or the UK. So, no standard contractual clauses, no binding corporate rules, no adequacy decision. That organisation had not subscribed to the EU US privacy framework, and as a result, that is an example of a piece of AI being used that is simply not suitable from a legal and regulatory perspective, even though it is a very, this is we're talking about very simple, straightforward uses of AI. So that's why I wanted to talk about having those guidelines in place and getting organizations to think about this and how they're using AI before we then stampede into how we're going to help an organization through getting accreditation. And this, of course, is where the ISO standards come out. So 42001 is the main AI standard, but it integrates into these other significant standards. Most of all there, the one I would focus on is ISO 27001, the Information Security Management Standard, which talks about protecting personal data models, protecting intellectual property from authorized access, unauthorized access or breaches, and integrates AI security controls. That's before we look at 9001, which looks at quality management, and 31,000, which looks at risk management as a whole. Now, the great thing about 42001 is that it integrates with these other systems. And indeed, if you're then getting accreditation across these multiple different standards, you'll have that level of integration. And you'll be able to then demonstrate compliance to the appropriate regulators that we've been talking about. So it could be complying with what a data protection regulator is looking for. You could be dealing with a specific AI focused regulator. So if you go to different jurisdictions, for example, in Saudi Arabia, they have their personal data protection law regulated by the NDMO, their data protection regulator, but above that is SODIA, the AI and data regulator. And you have to make sure you're demonstrating compliance with the requirements of these various regulators when it comes to making sure that your system is complying. And of course, if we're looking at global organizations, you might be looking at complying with the systems in multiple different jurisdictions. For example, if you're using AI and smart contracts to facilitate payments across a supply chain in different countries, you may end up having to make sure that you're complying with legal and regulatory standards in those multiple different countries. What better way of doing that than by having the right systems in place, having taken the right steps in terms of accreditation, and then integrating with these standards? Hence, we can see where the savings in terms of efficiency become apparent. Other standards that they integrate with include 26,000, which looks at social responsibility, and 27,701, which is the additional step to 27,001, looking at privacy information management, looking at how AI systems handle personal data and comply with privacy requirements, including implementing data protection controls around AI governance. So let's have a look at some of the key themes under 42001. There are 6 main headings within the accreditation as a whole. AI ethics and value-based decision making. We're still looking, even though AI is not a new thing, it didn't come around in 2022 with ChatGPT. Alan Turing, the famous physicist, was talking about AI and perfecting the Turing test in the 1940s. He was writing papers in the 1940s and early 1950s on AI ethics, talking about the ethics of decision making being undertaken by a system that is undertaking its own learning, machine learning. And therefore, issues around AI ethics are comparatively well developed, and it's important to consider these when it comes to our value-based decision making. And sometimes there needs to be a level of transparency, therefore, in place with regards to how AI is being deployed accordingly. Hence, algorithmic transparency and explainability is key. Black box AI can be great from an efficiency perspective, but sometimes being able to confirm the basis upon which decisions are being taken is key in terms of being able to demonstrate compliance with legal and regulatory frameworks in different countries. It can also serve, for example, to assist with compliance. I was talking earlier about the idea of a smart contract. If you've got a smart contract underpinned by distributed ledger technology, You want to make sure that that complies with the legal and regulatory framework for how contracts operate, of course. And that may change from one country to another if you've got a contract operating between parties in two different jurisdictions. In that instance, it might be important to show that you can comply with the common law that might be in place in that country with regards to what forms a contract, the basics around form and function, offer, acceptance, intention. How can you tell intention in a distributed ledger contract? That's where these things come in. So that level of transparency and explainability is key. Human oversight and control is something that very often is mandated by some of the regulatory systems that are being developed around AI. If you look at what the EU AI Act is looking for, with higher risk AI systems, they look for a degree of human oversight and control, or indeed human override in some instances. But that level of human oversight may mean that a task is 90% carried out by AI, but there is then a level of human oversight and checking and verification. This can be key in terms of verifying, of course, whether there might be any bias or unfairness with regards to what information is being produced from the AI. For this very reason, AI has been used in a number of studies. Indeed, though AI was being used quite a few years ago now to try and model different decisions that might be taken in a legal setting. And of course, it was found that if there were biases inherent in some of the judgments being used to train the AI, guess what? If there was bias in the judgments, you then get bias in the decisions that came out from the AI afterwards. So if you have bias in the human data that was put in, you'll get bias out of the AI afterwards. And it's important to be cognizant of this when we are assessing the results that we're getting back from AI, when we are using large language models. And that's where then, of course, having AI data governance and traceability is key. So we can look at where data is coming from to train models. We can look at what outputs are coming through. We can also trace, for example, where data is being stored, how long it's being retained for. Complying with these basics then ensures compliance with some of the principles that are in place with regards to data protection, protection of personal data in many different jurisdictions. And that then brings us to things like life cycle management in terms of data retention, data security, deletion, and indeed to transfer if data is being transferred from one country, from one jurisdiction to another. So we can see that these six key themes are essential to the operation of ISO 42001. Our core components are principally aimed on AI management systems, AIMS. We've got AI risk assessment, AI impact assessment, data protection, and AI security. AI risk assessment and impact assessment are, of course, key here. Assessing the risk around AI is crucial when it comes to complying and demonstrating compliance with things like the EU AI Act and other regulatory systems that are being created. Having shown that you are cognizant of that risk, that you are aware of it and you're doing something about it to reduce it, therefore shows a degree of demonstration of compliance, and indeed being cognizant of the impact that that risk may have on the organization, its operation, and above all, any impact on the data subjects whose personal data may be processed by an AI system, which then brings us, of course, to the impacts from a data protection and AI security perspective. Bear in mind the varying standards when it comes to data protection. It is always key to bear in mind, for example, that while the European Union has GDPR, the EU General Data Protection Regulation, which is in place across all countries within the European Economic Area, that is all the countries within that are EU member states plus Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein. Bear in mind that each individual EU member state has its own data protection laws, and sometimes each country can have multiple different regulators. Look at Germany, that has multiple different data protection regulators within the Federal Republic of Germany. My point is that therefore data protection law and enforcement can vary greatly even within a pan-national organization like the European Union. So questions around data protection and AI security, and indeed demonstrating best practice and compliance around data protection, is therefore really important. A lot of countries that aren't going down the route of having specific bespoke AI legislation are saying instead, ensure that any system, any AI system, any large language model, make sure it displays basic compliance with the data protection laws within our country, within our jurisdiction. So therefore, while it's what data protection, there is only one of four core components, it is crucial in terms of being able to potentially demonstrate compliance from a legal and regulatory standpoint. So an AI management system is a structured framework designed to oversee and manage implementation, organization, and risks associated with AI technologies within an organization. Managing systems, demonstrating compliance, showing what you're doing. It's always that principle of showing you're working for those who remember having to study mathematics or math, as for our people from the US who are here today. But the point here is that you've always got to show what you're doing. Just saying we are complying is never enough. You have to have something there in terms of evidence to show what you're doing. And therefore, an AI management system can do that to demonstrate what you're doing in order to demonstrate compliance. And of course, we then have AI controls in terms of the controls that we would hope to see. Bias and fairness checks. Are we looking at the outputs? Are we constantly making sure we're checking and assessing in case there is any bias in terms of any outputs from an AI system? Are we measuring our level of human oversight? Can we demonstrate that level of human oversight if asked? Can we ensure that we are showing compliance from a data governance perspective? So, for example, complying with something like the EU's Data Act, or in the UK, we recently have the Data Use and Access Act passed this year, which changes a number of issues fundamentally from a data protection and governance perspective. Are we able to show that we have security controls in terms of use and access around AI? And indeed, do we have change management to keep a track of patches and updates that may be installed? Bear in mind that when it comes to AI, it is evolving incredibly rapidly. A failure to update in terms of patches may lead to security issues that then become a problem. If you have a policy that says we incorporate patches, updates regularly, or for example, within 48 hours or 72 hours of them being issued, and then you don't comply with that, that can cause a problem. One law firm in the UK was fined last year when their stated policy was we install updates and patches within a 72-hour window. And then, of course, it turned out that they didn't do that. They were hacked and they didn't install the patch for 6 months. So if you're saying that you have a policy around we do things within a certain length of time, make sure you do it. If you don't do it, that's where regulators tend to have a bit of a sense of human failure. So what are we doing around the world? We have the OECD framework. This demonstrates and classifies AI activities into five socio-technical dimensions. We have the human and institutional involvement, data and input characteristics, AI model design and functionality, deployment context, and the expected impacts on society and the environment. I think that fifth point is really important there in terms of what will the impact be on society, on an economy, on individuals, as well as the environment. Bear in mind the huge quantities of energy required each time we use AI, to the point that already advice is being given that if you receive an answer from your AI, don't turn around and say thank you. As when it then says you're welcome, that's taken extra energy. This sounds ridiculous, but when you think that a huge amount of power is needed to run the data centers full of all those microchips that we require in order to be able to make these large language models function, the impact, therefore, on the environment from a use of energy perspective is important. And indeed, the environmental perspective of having increasing volumes of data centers being built on areas of green belt, on areas potentially of outstanding natural beauty. So we have to think of this in terms of the environment, the impact on the environment, before we look at those more fundamental points in terms of human involvement, the types of data and input characteristics, where is data being used to train a system, where is its data going, design functionality, and indeed deployment in terms of how the AI is going to be used. I've talked a little bit about cross-border considerations, and this is so important, particularly then when we look at the EU's AI Act. It classifies different types of risk. And then, of course, if you have a model that is felt to be in that unacceptable risk, that could lead to a system being prohibited within the European Union. Likewise, there are the high risk, limited risk, and medium risk categories. But even then, even if you're into limited risk, there is a level of transparency that has to be clear there so you can explain why it is limited risk. Transparency, of course, is required to allow for the classification for all five of the different risk levels here, because you have to have the transparency to understand how a system is operating in order to be able to classify the risk accordingly. Lack of transparency, lack of being able to do that. So in terms of its implementation, the EU has developed tools like its AI Act compliance checker. It's even put together the tools to help you work out if a piece of AI, if a system actually complies from a legal and regulatory perspective. And the idea here is that the Act will be able to foster innovation while hopefully ensuring and demonstrating safety, and indeed also putting Europe's fundamental rights at its heart. So we've got those compliance obligations that are in place on the providers, i.e. the developers, the deployers, the users, and also from a more general purpose perspective. In the US, we've got the NIST framework, NIST, developed by the US National Institute of Standards and Technology to provide a structured and technical model for trustworthy and secure AI. And a central feature of this is the idea of being able to test, evaluate, verify, and validate, in which the idea being that organizations can ensure that AI systems behave as expected in a safe and reliable manner. So the point there is hoping that there has been a good level of testing, beta testing, evaluation before a system goes live to prove that it will operate in a way that therefore demonstrates compliance with the framework. And in the UK, what have we got? Well, we had a framework published in March of 2023, a white paper. It's emphasised that this is going to be a framework rather than having any specific act of parliament. It sets out 5 principles for regulatory regulators to interpret, and then we've got therefore this sector-specific approach that is being followed by independent regulators. So the idea here is to enshrine at the heart of where the AI operates, to have that safety, security, and robustness, that transparency I keep mentioning, fairness above all, as well as accountability, governance, and contestability and redress. So as you can see there, operational and transparency requirements are key in being able to comply with all of the requirements in place there with regards to the UK's approach to AI from that legal and regulatory perspective. So ISO 42000 is largely a new international standard that helps organizations to set up a structured AI management system to ensure safe, responsible, trustworthy AI. It focuses on risk management and really demonstrating that you're managing and approving that risk. And many countries are now moving towards having a clear, harmonized set of global rules using standards like 42001 to align expectations and reduce any regulatory conflict that may occur. I think one of the key things to bear in mind here that when it comes to accreditation systems like this, we're looking at many countries where they're saying, well, we aren't going to have any clear legal and regulatory framework. Others that are actually putting in place quite rigorous systems. And therefore, when it comes to evaluating what is the best way to go, having a system in place like this means that you are showing best efforts. You're complying with industry best practice. You are doing and leading in terms of making sure that you are considering the use of AI, that you are managing risk, and you are putting systems in place as well as training your staff and demonstrating compliance with what may be an emerging legal and regulatory framework, i.e. there might not be any significant black letter law in place right now, but there could be in several years' time. And from that perspective, therefore, you can think, well, at least we are getting our standards in place. We are considering how our systems will operate. We are considering what we will do in order to be able to demonstrate compliance as far as we can with regards to our whatever standards may come to pass. Now, one thing I wanted to flag up as well is that some of the laws in place sometimes can change. I've talked about the EU AI Act, and I've talked about data protection standards. And in Europe, both of these things are likely to change. A couple of weeks ago, a document was published called the EU Digital Omnibus. These are a set of proposals, and at the moment they are just that, proposals, but they've been issued from the European Commission. The European Commission is the body that issues the regulatory proposals. Bear in mind that the European Parliament cannot do that itself. The European Parliament can only receive things from the Commission, decide what it wants to do, and then either vote and pass or not. So, from a regulatory perspective, it's therefore important in terms of what comes out from the Commission. And the Commission is saying we are going to put a line through quite large parts of the EU AI Act, and we are going to reform the way that GDPR operates. At the moment, these are just proposals. But should they pass, they will change in quite a fundamental way, and to a certain extent, they will deregulate in the European Union the way that tech and AI will operate. To a certain extent, this is to encourage innovation. It is also designed to reduce the regulatory burden that may apply to small and medium-sized enterprises. The idea is to try and reduce that burden, to improve the level of innovation that may take place, and to try and cut back on some of the red tape that some legal and regulatory systems sometimes end up applying. In particular, when you look at the greater levels of growth over the last 20 years in the United States, in comparison, it has led to the legislators in Europe thinking, well, if we cut back a little bit on our regulation, will it promote growth? We might not get to the same size and level that the US has been able to follow, but it might help. So that's the perspective in terms of how they are approaching legal and regulatory reform. So from that perspective, we have to think, okay, they are potentially looking at a level here of deregulation. And this demonstrates the fact, as I say, that some of the legal and regulatory standards are in flux. At the moment, for example, if you were in the United Kingdom, every single piece of regulatory guidance that has been issued by the Information Commissioner's Office has a helpful rubric at the top that says, please be aware of the fact that we are in the process of reviewing our guidance around AI and data protection because of the new UK Data Use and Access Act. That guidance that they'll have is therefore subject to change and review into 2026. Therefore, this has significant implications for organisations as wanting to try and demonstrate compliance from a legal and regulatory perspective. And it shows the difficulty of doing that if you're just following things from the letter of the law perspective. So therefore, coming back to what we're recommending here, if you're working towards a ISO accreditation over a period of several years, you will be in due course putting together the risk management steps. You'll be putting together those risk assessments. You'll be identifying risk, minimizing it, and indeed identifying who is responsible for that risk at either an individual level or, for example, what team or department or section is going to manage that risk. And by doing that, you can then reduce risk and indeed have a degree of accountability attached to that risk management and reduction as well. And that's generally good practice around the idea of having, for example, a data protection impact assessment, or as one of the things that I do a lot with my clients is AI data protection impact assessments, which operates specifically around AI systems that are being introduced. We've taken the template provided by the UK data protection regulator, the ICO, and we've amended that to make sure it reflects the way that different AI systems operate, so that we can identify risk with regards to infrastructure, with regards to data, with regards to deployment, with regards to the operation of that system, and then be able to track and demonstrate the tracking of that risk when it comes to then being able to demonstrate that to a regulator. The other reason why it's a good idea to do this is because it's not just demonstrating compliance to a regulator. Bear in mind now the long supply chains that the average organization has. One of our clients in Hong Kong has a supply chain of at least 20 odd different organizations. Our client is a digital business, but they have a long supply chain in terms of providers, in terms of developers, in terms of web space, in terms of marketing, in terms of compliance, in terms of design, in terms of telecommunications. By the time you add on all of these different suppliers, sometimes it is essential that either the organization at the head of that queue can demonstrate to the supply chain what standards do we have in place, or indeed, when you are then working with that supply chain, you might want to quickly identify, well, how compliant are you with our systems? Can you demonstrate compliance with the jurisdictions where we are looking to operate. So therefore, from that perspective, it is absolutely key that you have this information available promptly so you can demonstrate compliance and say, this is what we do. You can then share that information with key stakeholders like other members of the supply chain. If you don't have that information available to hand, that could be the difference between keeping a supplier on board, keeping a customer on board, and losing them if you aren't able to answer the due diligence questions that you may be asked. Same thing if it comes to potentially being able to provide answers to a potential customer who is scoring the suitability of your product against a pre-agreed questionnaire or criteria that they have. If you can just provide them en masse with the evidence that you have in terms of how you're demonstrating compliance with these key frameworks, you will be ahead of the game compared to where your competitors may be. So we can see from that perspective why it's a good idea to have these accreditations, but also going back to the first principles I talked at the top of this session with regards to AI guidelines. It is important for the leadership within organizations to sit down and think about these issues from the outset, to think about how they're going to approach compliance around AI in terms of how they're going to be asking their staff to comply with requirements around AI. Are they going to be telling staff don't have certain apps or apps present on your mobile devices? Do not use some of the free AI systems and platforms that are out there. Only use the systems that we provide for you, or only use them in a way that we direct through our guidance and training. Once you've started to think about that, it is then a lot easier to go down this route of being able to demonstrate compliance through an accreditation. Because if you've not got buy-in from a board or a key leadership team, it is very difficult then to get the organisation to devote the proper resources into demonstrating compliance with an accreditation like this. You might be able to get sign-off on support to be able to get appropriate accreditations, but these are not something that should just be obtained and then left to gather dust at the side. Good, effective use of these accreditations means baking that demonstration of compliance into the way an organisation operates across multiple different levels. Our risk registers being updated, our data privacy impact assessments being properly logged and managed on a regular basis. It is important to be able to show that not only do you have these standards in place, they are baked in and being complied with. And it's the evidence of that compliance you then use to demonstrate compliance to a regulator or a stakeholder, a key third party, or potentially a customer. So without that buy-in, that's not going to happen. It's a matter of developing that culture within an organization of being able to demonstrate that you're complying through everything that you do. That means that you've got to have that brought in from the leadership. They have to agree with it. They have to devote the proper resources. They have to then make sure that the right compliance mechanisms are present throughout all of the corporate governance, all of the policies, everything from a compliance and management perspective to show that not only have you got these accreditations, you're demonstrating them and you're using them. The advantage of that, you can demonstrate all of this to those key partners, those key stakeholders. You can demonstrate it through leadership to your internal staff. You can demonstrate it to customers, clients, etc. And crucially, when it comes around to reaccreditation, you can demonstrate how you're using these accreditations and how they're helping you, which will then help, of course, when it comes to reaccreditation and showing you are continuing to use the system to use these accreditations, bearing in mind, of course, that with AI, systems are going to evolve and change. So standards within these accreditations may evolve over time. But if you are using them in the right way, if you've got that way of demonstrating compliance within your organization, you'll be able to meet the criteria that are required far more easily. So ultimately, what will it mean? You'll be complying from a legal and regulatory perspective. You'll be having the benefits of being a leader with regards to demonstrating compliance with these standards and complying from a legal and regulatory perspective. You'll have buy-in from your staff. They will feel safe and secure. They will feel that you're innovating because you are using AI in the right way and being responsible with it. And hopefully the business will benefit from all of that. So ultimately, we've got different approaches being taken, but these international standards can help an organization, a multinational, to remain compliant when it's carrying out its cross-border transactions, making it easier to operate globally while meeting the new legal requirements that may come in. I hope you found the discussion useful there. Please do. We've got a Substack that you're welcome to find. If you're a fan of Substack, there's a QR code there if you want to scan that. That will mean that you can then stay in touch with advice and guidance that we give out. At the moment, that Substack is very much around cybersecurity. We will be doing a data protection and an AI Substack in due course. I also produce a free podcast. So if you found the discussion today interesting, hopefully enlightening, please do feel free to join me on our podcast. We regularly look at issues like this around AI as well as data protection and cybersecurity. We regularly have discussions. You can also find us on YouTube. Lots of free videos up there to look at, looking at issues around data and compliance. And we do look at things from an international perspective. We look at examples of data protection breaches around the world. We look at cyber incidents around the world, and we look at what the issues are from a compliance perspective. So thank you for your kind attention today. I hope you have found this session useful. I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you may have, but I will now hand back to our host. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Peter. It was very insightful session, and I'm also sure that like our audience have got to know something different this time with all the different countries being covered. So now the floor has officially opened for questions and answers. Please feel free to connect with the speaker for any query, and thank you everyone for joining this session. You can go ahead and ask your questions and in the chat box. So, Peter, we are having one question from the live which is going on. Why is ISO for 42001 important for managing AI system across different countries?
So where it's useful from that perspective is the fact that you can demonstrate a high degree of compliance that should allow you to be able to demonstrate that in multiple different jurisdictions. So the good thing here is if, for example, you're using you're multinational and you might have an office in, say, an EU member state, you might have another one in the Middle East, you may have another in Asia. There are, of course, wildly varying standards in place from a legal and regulatory perspective in all of those jurisdictions. And rather than trying to square the circle in terms of exactly what is required in Europe, along with exactly what might be required in Saudi Arabia, as well as exactly what is required in Hong Kong, by ensuring that you're then hitting the standard with something like 42001, you can say, well, look, we've got this accreditation. We can have the kite mark present on all of our collateral. We can show that we are reaching this level. And therefore, we can be assured that we are therefore complying from a legal and regulatory perspective. And of course, the benefit there comes in, should you then find that, for example, with the EU AI Act, there are very large levels of enforcement that can be applied there in terms of monetary penalty notices, fines. Yeah, you could potentially be on the end of a large fine in the event of failing to comply. So in that instant, therefore, it seems a good idea to be able to demonstrate compliance with those those EU regulators accordingly.
Okay, so we have one more question from Edemola. I work in the banking and financial sector. Please, from a supervisory standpoint, what key indicators or metrics should regulators look for to assess the maturity of an institution's AI governance framework under ISO 42001, particularly in a relation to accountability, model transparency, and data integrity across jurisdictions?
I think in that instance, regulators are looking for really a high degree of demonstrating compliance. So I was talking earlier on with regards to data, for example, AI data protection impact assessments. We end up, for example, working with our clients on those in a whereby we end up saying, look, not only do you have to actually carry this out, you should then be able to, for example, show who is responsible for certain areas of compliance, and then to actually return to that on a regular basis. So you might carry out an AI DPIA in Q1 in the first quarter. And then you'll return to it 3 months later, and you'll return to it 3 months after that. And each iteration of that AI DPIA serves as evidence to then show how you are tracking and reducing and managing risk. And I think it's metrics like that, really, in terms of being able to turn around and say, we have people who are clearly responsible here for managing and reducing risk. We have the systems in place which are there through the, for example, having an AI DPI, that you've got it in place. You can show that this is being evolved and used. It is not something that was just right, we carried that out and then we forgot about it. You can show that there are individuals working on that, that they are continuing to reduce risk, and that those metrics can then be followed. And you can see, for example, on a risk register that evolves over time, you may see an area of risk around AI at one point where it starts off as comparatively higher risk to an organization, and then is managed down over a period of many, many months.
Thank you so much for the informative answer. We have one more question from the same participant. As financial institutions increasingly deploy AI in areas like credit assessment, AML/CFT monitoring, and fraud detection, how can supervisors leverage ISO 42001 and ISO 27001 frameworks to evaluate institutional readiness, risk controls, and ethical compliance without stifling innovation?
That's a really good question. And funnily enough, I've been working with one of my clients on this very issue. Because particularly you've mentioned there things like credit assessment, AML, money laundering monitoring, fraud detection. Increasingly, quite big strides are being made in that field through things like data enrichment, being able to acquire large volumes of data that may allow you to then be able to take a view with regards to whether a individual or organization is showing propensively a higher risk or a lower risk. This doesn't necessarily have to be personal data. So from the assurance perspective, if you're able to identify that a particular postal code or zip code area is lower risk than another, you could say, right, for all the people whose vehicles are being insured in that area, we will lower their premium. And you might do a higher premium for those in an area where more vehicle crime takes place. So that's the example of data enrichment coming through, and it doesn't necessarily have to contain specific personal data, but by carrying out modeling based on that data, you are then able to turn around and potentially innovate insofar as you are able to innovate in terms of offering higher or lower premiums and potentially attracting more customers as a result by having a more attractive product that is more relevant to them. Now, in terms of how that is managed, it's several fold in terms of how it's done. First of all, we've worked quite closely with the client to say, bear in mind that if you can take all the personal data out of that data set, data protection law falls away. So if you can have a data set and you can remove things like names, or if you've got a zip code or postal code, if you can make that just relevant to the area rather than the full code itself, that will therefore just be personal data rather than data that identifies an individual. So you can take that data set, you can do your modeling, and you can potentially then turn around and work out where the areas of lower or higher risk are. So that's one key thing in terms of being able to sort of how you're handling data. Can you look at a data set, remove the risk? Can you either anonymize or pseudonymize the data in it? And that then will potentially allow the deployment of AI to allow for that reduction of risk or to assess a credit score accordingly. So sometimes being able to just get the personal data element out of there will then mean, right, we can innovate, we can do whatever it is we're wanting to do. That's one key aspect. When we're then coming into the use of these accreditations, these frameworks, The fact that hopefully you've then got those frameworks in place and you've looked at risk, and you're then saying we've got controls in place to manage that risk, that then hopefully will free up your data scientists and AI engineers to be able to go, well, if we are cognizant of that risk, and we may have one or two controls in place, once we've done that, you can then proceed within the envelope that we are operating in to be able to then proceed to innovate. The other thing to consider sometimes actually is if you've got those frameworks in place, is it possible to put together a sort of safe sandbox area from a legal and regulatory perspective? Go off and come up with the model, come up with the research. What is it that you're wanting to do? And we can then take that, assess it, see if it's safe and secure, and move on from there. The idea of having a legal and regulatory sandbox like that is something that's been done in the UK. It's also been done in, I think it was Singapore, and it's also been done in Saudi Arabia. So you've got examples there of some regulators that are being quite proactive and saying, well, we'll have a regulatory sandbox. Bring your model along to us. Let's have a look at it. Let's work out how it does or does not comply from a legal and regulatory perspective. But we want to help you innovate first, and then we can hopefully then make sure that it fits in within the secure environment of our sort of that the sandbox, the play area. You could play with it, see how it works, and we can try and then construct the appropriate legal and regulatory framework around it. So sometimes the fact that you've got the governance in place from 42001 and 27001 means that you can then show that you've evaluated from a risk and readiness perspective and can encourage some of that compliance without stifling innovation. Your question is well made because you don't want to have all of these, go to all of this trouble, spend all this money, and then find that you're actually inhibiting innovation. That shouldn't be what happens with any of this. I always work very hard with my clients not to turn around and go, no, you can't do that. It's like, well, how are we going to do that within the legal and regulatory framework and then working to try and make sure it does that? But you never want to be saying no. You always want to be turning around saying, well, this is how we can make it happen. Just below, I can see that question as well in there. We also had someone asking about resharing the slides on the approach to AI. I'll be
Yeah.
sharing those on LinkedIn as well, but I'm sure you'll end up sharing them for all of our delegates today as well.
Course. So this is going to be the last question from Siddeshwar. Could you please elaborate a little more on the OEDC framework and its scope of influence on the development of the ISO 42001 standard?
Sure. So let me just bring up my note on the OECD. So the key aspect in terms of what that framework will do. So I'm just going to bring up, as I say, bring up my note on that. So I can give you a little bit more. Right. So the OECD framework has been very much developed from a the point of view of managing risk and impacts of AI through a multi-stakeholder and life cycle orientated perspective. So stakeholders will be not just the developers and the deployers of AI, the users, but also the policymakers and the end users and society more broadly at large. So the idea is the framework will be used by all of those who are invested in the use of AI. In other words, those who play an active role in the life cycle of an AI system from cradle to grave. The idea being that you've got organizations, individuals that deploy or operate AI. So then you've got those five socio technical dimensions that we talked about, whereby you've got human and institutional involvement, you've got data and input characteristics, AI model design and functionality, deployment, and the expected impacts on society and the environment. But the idea here as well is that each dimension will support a broader, more holistic approach to understanding where and how AI risk arises. So looking at things like privacy, looking at bias, transparency, accountability, and potentially that element of unintended societal consequences. So the OECD has taken a very broad brush approach here. And I don't. I think when it comes to how ISO 42001 is going, I mean that's more of a it is of course operates in a far more detail orientated way. OECD really here has a much more broad brush perspective in terms of what it's looking to do. But I think it's important with both that and the NIST framework here is that really ISO 42001 takes them and it builds on them to a large extent with a lot more detail. So I hope that's helpful.
Of course, and yeah, with this, I would like to say thank you so much once again for joining this session, offering new information to the audience. And Peter, would you like to make a final statement for today's session?
Um, I think first of all, everyone who's joined the session today is doing the right thing. You are thinking about risk and you're thinking about the management of risk around your use of AI. So I think sometimes we tend to forget that outside of the fields that are interested in things like legal and regulatory compliance, we very often tend to forget that we might be interested in it, but there is a vast sea of people out there who are designing, developing, using AI, deploying it, and are not thinking about this. So, first of all, you guys, congratulations. You've thought, I need to think about this, and you've come along and you've listened today. So, congratulations. But it doesn't end here. Different standards will evolve in different countries. Some countries are further ahead than others. Some countries and areas are already rolling back, as I've said. So I think it's really important to stay on top of this. Keep on with your journey of learning, following what's happening in different countries, different jurisdictions. Become an advocate for being able to talk about the benefit of staying ahead of the standards in any country or organization by then thinking, right, let's invest in getting the right level of accreditation. So, really, as I say, you've all demonstrated leadership by joining today's session. Continue to do that. And above all, and I say this as a lawyer, very often lawyers, we end up having these systems whereby we learn and then we qualify as lawyers and then we stop learning. With tech, you have to stay on top of it every day. So make sure you're subscribing to whatever newsletter, newspaper, website that gives you updates in terms of how systems are evolving so that you can then work out what accreditation systems are right for you and to then help you in putting that in place. But look, thank you for joining today. I hope that's been helpful. And, thank you as well for your really good questions. Thank you.
It was a pleasure, Peter. I have also shared a link to Peter's LinkedIn account in the chat box. So please feel free to, connect with him on LinkedIn. And yes, before you guys go, I have a few announcements to make. If you would like to opt the certificate for today's session, you can get it on our website, gsccouncil.org, and we are giving a special discount, 20% discount to all the participants who have joined in. And yes, you are also getting a 100% discount for the utility tool, which you can utilize for making professional presence on LinkedIn, as well as a strong portfolio and a resume, and which is definitely going to help you open the doors for the global opportunities. The code for it is like AUG100, and this is only for the attendees who have attended today's session. And we have amazing panel for tomorrow, day after tomorrow, and the December 5th. Tomorrow, Rohit Singh will be telling us more about the ISO using IAM in the ISO 42101 and like 27001. We also are having another learning in practice real world L&D case studies and across industries, which has been going on for this week and upcoming weeks from 1st December to 5th December, and then from 8th to 12th December as well. And side by side, there is also one more series which has been going, AI implementation series. We also have amazing panel of the experts for that as well. This is the time to thanks, a special thanks to Astik, Rakesh, and Bandi for making today's session more interesting by offering references to people. Even if you would like to earn about $50 discounts and certification, you can go to the GSDC website and learn more about it, how to get the referral points. And if you would like to join us as a speaker or become one of the the podcast guests, please reach us out on the email address which I'm sharing in the box. If you enjoyed today's session and if you have any takeaways that you would like to tell, please review us on reviews.io. It will mean much. And you can also join our WhatsApp group community and visit the website for the more information. Lastly, thank you to everyone. Thanks to Peter especially and the rest of the attendees who are here today. I will be seeing you tomorrow, same time for the ISO session. And yes, have a good day and a good night. Thank you, everyone.